Today we rarely stop to think about how English actually works, how a word should be spelled, what a word is supposed to mean. Most of the time, there are clear rules. But 300 years ago, English was deeply chaotic. Spelling was inconsistent and the meaning of words often changed. And inside this small house in London, a poor writer decided to do something almost impossible: to bring greater order to the English language. In the 18th centuries, even the same words could appear in several different spellings. Sometimes people even spell the same words differently within the same document. And even Shakespeare's name appear in different spelling over time. Today we are able to communicate smoothly in English, including me making this video in English and you watching it right now. In some ways, many of the rules and standards of English we use today began to take shape during that period. And one of the people who tried to make English more consistent was Samuel Johnson. In 1737, Johnson arrived in London. At the time, he had almost nothing. He had once studied at Oxford, but was forced to leave because he could not afford to stay. He was often ill and nearly blind in one eye. No powerful connections, no money. Sometimes he even struggled to afford food. But he did have one thing: an almost obsessive sensitivity to language. Before coming to London, Johnson had already spent years writing. He worked as a teacher and even tried to start a school, but failed. Writing became almost the only skill he could rely on. A year later, he published a long poem called London. The poem quickly attracted attention. Even the famous poet Alexander Pope reportedly said, "Whoever wrote this will soon be known." Publishers began to notice this brilliant but somewhat strange writer. A few years later, a group of London booksellers approached him. They wanted someone to take on a difficult challenge: to create a truly complete dictionary of the English language. Johnson accepted the job. He believed he could finish the dictionary in 3 years, but he quickly realized he had underestimated the chaos of the language itself. In the time before digital search and before databases, every definition had to be organized by hand. Johnson and his assistant went through a huge number of books, searching line by line for how words were actually used. They copied quotations, grouped meanings together, and compared how different writers used the same word. The house became filled with books and papers. Notes, drafts, and quotations were everywhere. And Johnson worked almost every day. What was supposed to take 3 years eventually lasted 9. For most of that time, he remained inside his house, constantly organizing, revising, and defining words. But the work itself was not the only difficulty. In the 18th century, large cultural projects like this usually depended on aristocratic support. A patron offered more than money. They also offered status, connections, and social recognition. Johnson approached the Earl of Chesterfield, one of the most influential aristocrats and cultural figures in London at the time. For writers in that era, being supported by someone like Chesterfield almost meant entering another world. Johnson once hoped that Chesterfield would become that kind of supporter, but in reality, the Earl showed little real interest in him. Johnson later recalled, waiting for long periods in the entrance hall of the Earl's house. Sometimes he was not even allowed in. The Earl gave him some money, but compared to the support Johnson had hoped for, it was mostly symbolic. For a writer like Johnson, who had no powerful background, the long years that followed would largely have to be forced alone. And Johnson could not survive on the dictionary project alone. To earn money, he had to keep writing. Between 1750 and 1752, he wrote a series of essays called The Rambler. In just 2 years, he produced more than 200 essays. And all of this happened while he was still working on the dictionary. But during those years, Johnson also suffered deep personal loss. In 1752, his wife Elizabeth died. Johnson lovingly called her Tatty. Friends later record that whenever he spoke about her, he became deeply emotional. But even in grief, the work on the dictionary continued. Day after day, Johnson returned upstairs, continuing to work through those endless words. But when the dictionary was finally close to completion, the Earl, who had long ignored Johnson, suddenly began publicly praising the project, as if he had always been one of its strongest supporters, as though the approval of a nobleman automatically gave him a share of the achievement. Johnson could not accept this, because he knew that during the hardest years, he himself had carried much of the burden of the work. In response to the Earl's sudden praise, Johnson wrote a famous letter. In it, he compared a patron to someone who watches a man drowning in the water and only offers help after he has already reached the shore. This was more than a personal act of anger. For a long time, writers and scholars often depended on aristocrats for survival and recognition. But Johnson's response, in some ways, also symbolized the beginning of a new era. Johnson was not only trying to shape the English language, he was also refusing to let aristocrats define the value of his work. Perhaps a writer no longer needed to depend completely on noble approval, but could instead stand before readers through the strength of the work itself. Because of this, the letter is often seen as the symbol of the independent spirit of modern writers. Johnson's dictionary was more than just a reference book. It was deeply shaped by his personality. Some definitions were humorous, others revealed how he understood life itself. For example, he defined lexicographer as a harmless drudge, busy tracing the origins of words and explaining their meanings. In some ways, it almost sounds like Johnson mocking himself. But not every definition was a joke. Some felt much more personal. For example, Johnson defined hope as the expectations of something desired. It sounds simple, but for a man who spent years struggling with poverty, illness, and loss, those words may have carried special weight. And in the word melancholy, one of Johnson's definitions was a kind of madness in which the mind is always fixed on one object. It is hard not to think about the man in the attic who spent 9 years working on his dictionary. Even though Johnson often struggled financially himself, he became known for his generosity. At different times, several people in difficult circumstances lived in his house. Among them was the blind poet Anna Williams, whom Johnson supported for many years. There were also struggling writers, former servants, and others facing hardship. Johnson often shared what little money he had, perhaps because he understood struggle so personally himself. Inside this house filled with words, books, and constant pressure, there was also Johnson's affection for his cat, Hodge. According to stories, Johnson would personally buy oysters for him, not because oysters were expensive. In the 18th century, oysters were actually common food for poor people. He simply did not want servants to begin resenting the cats for making them run errands. Today, a statue of Hodge still stands outside the house. After all these years, London still remembers Johnson and Hodge. In 1755, Johnson's dictionary was finally published. It contained more than 40,000 words and a huge number of quotations from literature. For more than a century afterward, it remained one of the most influential dictionaries in the English-speaking world. But perhaps Johnson's greatest legacy was more than just a dictionary. Before that, English was still filled with confusion and inconsistency. Words had no fixed spelling, meanings often changed, and Johnson's dictionary was an attempt to standardize English, from spelling to meaning to the way people use words. It slowly shaped how people understood and wrote English. And all of this happened inside this ordinary little house in London. A poor and lonely writer who spent years struggling through hardship devoted 9 years to endless words, notes, and manuscripts. More than 2 centuries have passed. Even today, we still use the words he carefully worked to define. The writer who once sat in a London attic, surrounded by papers, quotations, and rough drafts, ultimately helped countless strangers understand one another.